Charlotte Fairchild stepped off the stagecoach into the blinding Nevada dust with a carpetbag in one hand, a crumpled letter in the other, and a plan already forming in her mind to be gone from this place within the month. The year was 1878, and the town of Calico Creek sat low against the desert like something the earth had tried to swallow and then thought better of. It was not much to look at: a single main street lined with sun-bleached storefronts, a saloon that never seemed to be fully closed, a church with a bell that had cracked sometime in the previous decade and now made a sound like a tin can struck with a hammer, and a general store that doubled as the post office, the doctor's waiting room, and apparently the place where mail-order brides were expected to wait until someone came to collect them. Charlotte had not wanted to come. She needed to be honest with herself about that, at least, even if she intended to be perfectly polite to everyone else. She had answered the advertisement placed in the Cincinnati Gazette by a man named Jedediah Lockhart, rancher, 30 years old, no family to speak of, owner of a modest cattle operation outside of Calico Creek, Nevada, because she had been desperate in the particular, grinding way that women of 1878 became desperate when they had no money, no prospects, and a landlord who had made it clear that her continued residence in his boarding house depended on a situation Charlotte was not willing to create. She had written to Jedediah Lockhart because she had to write to someone. She had come to Calico Creek because she had run out of options in Cincinnati. But she had made herself a promise on the long, rattling, miserable stagecoach ride from the rail terminus at Carson City. She would give this arrangement 3 weeks, no more. And if she found it impossible, if the man was cruel or drunk, or simply the particular kind of lonely that clings to a person and tries to pull everyone else down with it, she would find a way out. She had a small amount of money sewn into the lining of her petticoat. Not enough to go back east, but enough to get somewhere. Enough to begin again in a different direction. She was 24 years old and she had already begun again 3 times, and she was prepared to do it a 4th. The general store smelled of sawdust and dried beans, and the woman behind the counter had the look of someone who had seen every variety of human arrival and was no longer surprised by any of them. She was broad-shouldered and perhaps 50, with iron-gray hair pinned severely back and sharp brown eyes that took Charlotte in from boots to bonnet in a single efficient sweep. "You'll be the Fairchild girl," the woman said. It was not a question. "Charlotte Fairchild," Charlotte agreed. "I'm looking for Mr. Jedediah Lockhart. He'll be along." The woman extended a hand across the counter. "I'm Mabel Greer. I run this store and I know everything that happens in this town, which means you should probably be kind to me." Charlotte shook the hand and found herself smiling despite herself. "I'll keep that in mind." "Jed's a good man," Mabel said, returning to her inventory without ceremony. "Quiet, works too hard, hasn't had an easy time of it since his father passed, but he's good. You could do considerably worse." She paused and looked up. "You will have done considerably worse, given that you came all the way from Ohio on a mail-order arrangement, which means the options back there weren't singing." "They weren't," Charlotte said simply. Mabel nodded as though this settled something, and went back to her inventory. Charlotte set her carpetbag down and looked out through the store's single front window at the street. A hawk was circling something above the ridge to the west. The sun was already dropping toward the horizon, turning everything the color of copper and old blood. It was beautiful in a way that felt almost aggressive, as though the landscape was daring her to find fault with it. She was still looking at the hawk when she heard boots on the boardwalk outside, and then the door opened and Jedediah Lockhart walked in. Her first impression was that he was taller than she had expected. Her second impression was that he seemed deeply uncomfortable about it, as though his own height was something he was perpetually apologizing for. He had taken his hat off before he came through the door, and he held it in both hands in front of him with the careful awkwardness of a man who was not used to being in situations where he didn't know what to do with his hands. He had dark hair that was cut practical and short, dark eyes that were quiet and watchful, and a jaw that had clearly not introduced itself to a razor in at least 3 days. He was lean in the particular way that outdoor work and not quite enough regular meals creates, and his shirt was clean but his boots were honest, which Charlotte noted because she had learned that boots told the truth about a man in a way that his face sometimes didn't. He looked at her for a moment, and she looked at him, and then he said, "Miss Fairchild," in a voice that was lower than she'd expected and careful, as though he had rehearsed the greeting many times and was still not certain he'd gotten it right. "Mr. Lockhart," she said, "I'm sorry I wasn't here when the stage came in. I had a fence lined down and I couldn't. It took longer than I thought." He stopped. "I should have been here. I was quite comfortable," Charlotte said. "Mrs. Greer was kind enough to let me wait." He glanced at Mabel, who did not look up from her inventory but made a small sound that might have been acknowledgement. Then he looked back at Charlotte and she could see him working through something, some internal calculation about what came next, what was appropriate, what was owed. "I have a wagon outside," he said. "I thought if you're not too tired from the journey I could take you out to the ranch, show you the place. Or we could stay in town tonight if you'd rather. The hotel has decent rooms. He stopped again. "I don't want to presume." It was the last thing that Charlotte had expected him to say. Every other version of this moment that she had rehearsed in her mind on the long journey west had involved a man who either wanted to drag her immediately to a preacher or wanted to make clear that he was in charge and she would do as she was told. She had not prepared for a man who didn't want to presume. "I'd like to see the ranch," she heard herself say, and she was surprised to find that she meant it, at least a little. The wagon ride out to the Lockhart property took the better part of an hour on a road that was more suggestion than fact, winding up through scrub brush and Joshua trees, and occasional red rock outcroppings that looked like they had been placed there by someone with a dramatic sensibility. Jedediah drove with the easy competence of someone who had made this trip 10,000 times, and for a while neither of them spoke, which Charlotte found less uncomfortable than she had expected. It was Jedediah who broke the silence first. "I don't know how much my letter told you about the place," he said. I don't write well. I mean, I can write. I'm not uneducated, but I don't always say what I mean when I'm writing it down." "Your letter was honest," Charlotte said. "That counts for more than elegant." He glanced at her sideways. "What did it tell you?" "That you have 300 acres, about 40 head of cattle, a house that you described as needs some attention, and that your nearest neighbor is 2 miles east and her name is Harriet Dunmore, and she's 70 years old and makes the best apple preserves in the county." The corner of his mouth moved. "That's all true." "It also said that you wanted a wife and not a servant, and that you thought that distinction was important enough to put in a letter to a stranger." Charlotte watched his profile. "That part was what made me write back." He was quiet for a moment. "A lot of men out here don't think about it that way." "No," Charlotte agreed. "They don't." "I wanted to be clear," he said. "I've been alone out here for 2 years since my father died, and I thought I should do this the right way or not at all." She looked out at the desert, which was turning purple now in the failing light. A coyote called somewhere in the distance, and another answered, and the sound was lonelier and more beautiful than any sound she had heard in Cincinnati's crowded streets. "Well," she said quietly, "we'll see." The ranch came into view around a bend in the road, and Charlotte's heart did something complicated. The house was small. She had known it would be small, a single-story structure of weathered timber with a covered porch running along the front. But it had clearly been recently scrubbed, and there were curtains in the 2 front windows, white muslin curtains that were so new she could see where they'd been folded in the bolt. There was a kitchen garden off to the side, not large but tended, with the remnants of summer vegetables still clinging. The barn behind the house was solid and well-maintained in a way the house perhaps wasn't, which told her something about how Jedediah Lockhart ordered his priorities. He stopped the wagon and sat for a moment without getting down, looking at the house as though seeing it through her eyes. "The curtains are new," he said. "I can see that. I put them up this morning." "I wasn't sure. I didn't know if it was the sort of thing." He stopped. Charlotte looked at the curtains in the windows of the small house at the edge of the Nevada desert and felt something shift very slightly in the part of her chest where she kept her plans. Just slightly. Not enough to change anything, but enough to notice. "They're very nice," she said. "Thank you." He climbed down from the wagon and came around to offer her his hand, and she took it, and stepped down onto the Nevada earth for the first time, and the ground was solid under her feet in a way that she had not expected it to be. The inside of the house was as she had anticipated, sparse, functional, clean in the way that men clean when they are trying hard. There was a main room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove, and shelves with a modest collection of books that surprised her. There was a single bedroom, and this was where she could see that Jedediah Lockhart had thought very carefully and very carefully avoided thinking at the same time, because there was a cot set up in the corner of the main room with a blanket folded on top of it. "I'll sleep out here," he said, and his voice was matter-of-fact, not making a performance of it. "For as long as you want. This is not a situation where I'm going to—" He stopped again. This appeared to be something he did regularly, Charlotte thought. He would begin a sentence and then decide that honesty required more precision than he currently had available. "I want you to be comfortable. The bedroom is yours." "That's very—" Charlotte paused because she had been about to say very kind, and that felt insufficient. "That's decent of you, Mr. Lockhart." "Jed," he said. "Most people call me Jed." "Jed," she said, trying it. It was a plain name. It suited him. She did not sleep well that first night, in the narrow bed in the small room, listening to the foreign sounds of the desert dark, the coyotes, the wind, a horse shifting in the barn, and occasionally the sound of Jedediah turning on his cot in the main room, also not sleeping. She lay on her back and stared at the ceiling and told herself that she had 3 weeks, and that 3 weeks was long enough to know what she needed to know, and then she would make her decision. She did not tell herself that the curtains had been white muslin and that he had put them up that morning. She told herself that only once, and then she made herself stop. The first week was not what she had expected, and she had expected quite a lot. She had expected to feel like a stranger in a strange house. She did feel that, but there was something underneath it that was warmer than strangeness, a kind of provisional domesticity that surprised her with its comfort. She discovered that Jedediah rose before dawn every morning without complaint or drama, made coffee that was strong enough to qualify as a structural material, and was out to the barn before the sun cleared the ridge. He came in for breakfast at 7:30, with the consistency of a man who understood that schedules were a form of respect. He ate without demanding to be served, washed his own dishes when she was occupied with something else, and spoke at the table with the careful, considered quality of someone who was aware that words had weight. Charlotte, for her part, explored the house with the systematic attention of someone who was assessing whether something could be improved. She found in the kitchen the rudiments of decent cooking, a sourdough starter wrapped in cloth at the back of a shelf, a good supply of dried beans and salt pork, a string of dried chilies hanging from a nail that she had not initially noticed. She found in the small bedroom single dresser a photograph of a man and woman that had to be Jedediah's parents. The man was tall with the same careful eyes. The woman was soft and round and laughing at something just outside the frame. She found on the bookshelf in the main room that Jedediah Lockhart owned a Bible, a copy of Paradise Lost that was so well read the spine had given up entirely, 2 volumes of A Natural History of the American West, and tucked behind them as though slightly embarrassed to be there, a collection of poetry by Lord Byron that was also considerably worn. She was reading this last one on the porch on the 4th evening when he came up from the barn, and stopped on the steps when he saw what was in her hands. I got that in Sacramento," he said, with the defensive speed of a man who has been caught in something innocent and can't quite explain why he feels the need to defend it. "There was a book dealer. It was a fair price." "Byron," Charlotte said. She looked at him over the top of the book. "I would not have predicted Byron." I like poetry, he said, coming up the steps and sitting on the top one looking out at the last of the sunset. There's something to it, the way it says things that he stopped, started again. My mother used to read to us in the evenings. My father wasn't a reading man, but he'd listen. He liked the sound of it even when he said he didn't understand it. He was quiet for a moment. She died when I was 16. After that, it was just my father and me, and there wasn't much reading. Charlotte looked down at the book in her hands. She sounds like she was lovely. She was. He looked at the horizon. This country was hard on her. I think she was happier in the last years when she stopped hoping it would turn into something it wasn't, when she just let it be what it was. Charlotte did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Is that possible? To love something once you've stopped hoping it will be different?" Jedediah looked at her. His dark eyes were steady and serious in the pink evening light. "I think it might be the only way," he said. She thought about that for a long time after in the bedroom, with the window open to the desert night. She thought about Cincinnati and the boarding house, and the landlord with his particular type of expectation, and the way that city had felt like a place that was always almost working, like a wheel that was just slightly off its axle, and making a grinding sound that everyone pretended not to hear. She had spent 4 years there after her parents died, first her mother of consumption, then her father of a broken heart that the doctor had called by the politer name of heart failure. And she had worked as a seamstress, and then a shop girl, and then a seamstress again. And all that time, she had been hoping that the city would eventually turn into something that could hold her properly. Never had. She was still thinking about this when she fell asleep, which was why she did not notice until morning that it had been the best sleep she'd had since leaving Ohio. On the 5th day, she met Harriet Dunmore. Harriet arrived on a mule that was clearly both ancient and deeply opinionated about the matter of being ridden. She was small and sharp-faced and wore a sunbonnet that had long since given up being a bonnet and was now more accurately a piece of fabric that remembered being a bonnet. She arrived at the porch at 9 in the morning with a jar of the apple preserves and an expression of intense curiosity that she made absolutely no effort to disguise. "Let me look at you," she said to Charlotte, holding her by both forearms and examining her face with the frank attention of someone assessing a horse. Pretty enough, got good eyes, are you strong?" "I carried my own carpetbag across 3 states, Charlotte said. "That'll do." Harriet released her and looked at the house. "He's cleaned this place up. I haven't seen it this clean since his mother was alive. That's a good sign. He's trying." She looked back at Charlotte. "Are you going to stay?" The directness of it was like a cold splash of water. Charlotte met it straight on. "I haven't decided." Harriet nodded slowly, as though this was an acceptable and intelligent answer. "Good. Don't decide too fast, but don't decide too slow either. This country doesn't have patience for too slow." She held out the jar of preserves. "These are good on the biscuits if you know how to make them, which I assume you do since you're from Ohio, and Ohio women know how to make biscuits." "I know how to make biscuits," Charlotte confirmed. "Then we'll get along fine." Harriet climbed back onto the mule with impressive agility for a woman of 70. "I'll tell you something since we're being honest. Jed Lockhart is the best man in this county. Possibly the best man in Nevada, though I haven't met all of them. He is also the stubbornest man in Nevada, and I have met most of those. He doesn't know how to ask for help, and he doesn't know how to show what he feels, and he's been lonely so long he thinks loneliness is just his natural state. He's wrong about that. Don't let him convince you he's right." And then she turned the mule and rode back down the road before Charlotte could say anything at all. Charlotte stood on the porch holding the jar of apple preserves, and the desert was very bright and very quiet, and somewhere in the distance one of the cattle lowed for no particular reason. She made biscuits that evening. Jedediah ate 3 of them without saying a word, and then he said, "These are very good," with a kind of restrained passion, as though he wanted to say something more extravagant and was holding himself back. "Harriet Dunmore told me to make them," Charlotte said. He looked up. "You met Harriet. She came by this morning." Charlotte watched his face. "She said you were stubborn." Something flickered in his expression. "That's fair." "She also said other things," Charlotte said, and did not elaborate and watched the flicker again, longer this time. "Harriet talks too much," he said, but he said it like a man who was grateful for someone who talked too much. On the 7th day, which was a Sunday, they went to the Calico Creek Church together for the first time. Charlotte had not asked to go. She simply put on her better dress and her bonnet, which was not the best bonnet she'd ever owned but was respectable, and appeared at the door at the appropriate time, and Jedediah, who had already hitched the wagon, looked at her for a moment with an expression that she was beginning to learn was his version of surprised pleasure, a very slight opening of his dark eyes and a stillness that preceded a warmth. The town turned out to see them, as towns do. Mabel Greer was there in the second row, and she gave Charlotte a nod that communicated several things at once. The pastor was a young man named Reverend Elias Cook, who had arrived from Illinois 2 years ago, and still had the slightly startled look of someone who was expecting the West to reveal itself as something smaller than it actually was. There were ranching families with sunburned children, and a few miners who had come in from the hills to the north, and a Mexican family named Vega who sat together near the back with quiet dignity and were, Jedediah told her in a low voice as they took their seats, the best horsemen in the county. Charlotte noticed that this was said as simple fact, with no elaboration, and she noticed also that Jedediah greeted the Vega family by name. The father was called Rodrigo, the mother Elena, and there were 4 children, the eldest a solemn young man of about 17. What Charlotte noticed, sitting in that crackbell church in the Nevada desert, was that Jedediah Lockhart was quietly and genuinely respected. Men nodded to him the way they nodded to someone whose opinion they cared about. Women asked after his cattle and his fence lines with real interest. He spoke to everyone in the same measured, careful way, not putting on a different face for different people, not playing a role. He was exactly who he was, and the town had noticed. Charlotte herself was obsessed with that combination of frank curiosity and Western directness that she was coming to recognize as the regional style. Several women introduced themselves, and they were all pleasant, and one of them, a woman named Dottie Hayes whose husband ran the livery stable, took Charlotte's hand and said, "I'm so glad he finally had the sense to advertise. We've been worried about him," with such genuine relief that Charlotte felt something tighten in her throat. Afterward, on the wagon ride home, Jedediah said, "I should have told you people will stare for a while. They'll talk about you. This is a small town." "I expected that," Charlotte said. "It doesn't bother you," she thought about it honestly. "I've had worse," she said. "In Cincinnati, people stared and talked and also didn't help you when you needed it. At least here it seems like they're curious rather than cruel." Jedediah was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What happened in Cincinnati?" She looked at the road ahead. A jackrabbit flashed across it and was gone into the brush. "My parents died 4 years apart," she said. "My mother first. Then my father. After that I was alone and I worked and I was fine, but—" She paused, finding the honest words. "There are different kinds of alone. There's alone that is just solitude, which can be peaceful. And then there's alone that is being in a city full of people who have all already made their arrangements and have no room in them for you. That second kind it's a grinding thing. It wears you down." Jedediah said nothing for a while. Then he said, "Yes," very quietly, as though she had described something he knew from the inside. "I wasn't fleeing," she said, because she wanted to be honest about this. "I want you to know that. I wasn't just running from something terrible. I was trying to find something better. There's a difference." "I know," he said, and she believed him. The second week brought 2 things that Charlotte had not anticipated: a crisis with the cattle and rain. The crisis came first. On Monday of the second week, Jedediah came in from his dawn round looking as taut as a fence line in winter, and said without preamble that 2 of his cattle were showing signs of something that looked like blackleg, which Charlotte knew was a disease, and which she could tell from his face was serious. He said it quietly and without drama, but she could see what it cost him, not just the potential loss of the animals, but the threat to the whole herd, the possibility of having to watch something he had built with 2 years of difficult solitary labor begin to come apart. "What do you need?" she said. He blinked at her. He had clearly expected she wasn't sure what. Alarm, perhaps, or questions she couldn't answer. "I need to get the sick ones isolated. I need to check every animal. I need to," he stopped. "I might lose some, maybe more than some." "Then let's get started," Charlotte said. He looked at her for a moment with that particular stillness. Then he got his hat and went back out, and she followed him, and she spent the better part of 2 days helping him move cattle, which was work she had never done before, and which was considerably more athletic and exhausting than she had imagined, and which also turned out to require a kind of patient, steady attention that she discovered she was capable of. They worked side by side, and he taught her without condescension how to read the animals, how to move them without panicking them, how to tell a sick one from a healthy one by the way it held itself. They lost 3 cattle in the end. Jedediah burned the carcasses in the field and stood looking at the smoke for a moment, and Charlotte stood beside him, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing to say that would make it less of a loss. Then he said, "Thank you for helping," and his voice was rough at the edges. "Of course," she said. "You didn't have to." "I know I didn't have to," she said. "I wanted to." He looked at her, and she looked back, and the smoke rose between them against the blue Nevada sky, and something in the air was different after that. Something had shifted in the way they moved around each other in the house, not dramatically, not in any way that could be named or pointed to, but real nonetheless, like a door that had been slightly ajar and was now open a little further. The rain came on Thursday of the second week. Nevada did not rain often, but when it did, the desert remembered all its thirst at once. Charlotte was at the kitchen table in the evening writing a letter to a friend back in Cincinnati. She was doing this partly out of habit and partly because she was not yet sure what she would say about her situation, and she was working it out on paper the way she sometimes worked things out, when the sky turned a particular shade of green that Jedediah later told her meant business, and then the thunder came, and then the rain. She had never seen rain like it. It came sideways and serious and drummed on the roof like something alive. The creek that ran behind the property, which was usually a modest trickle, became something considerably more emphatic. Jedediah came in from seeing to the animals soaking wet and laughing for the first time she had seen him laugh, just a short, surprised sound, but real, his wet hair plastered to his forehead and his eyes lit. "The creek's going to flood a little," he said. "Nothing that'll hurt the house, but listen to it." Charlotte listened. The sound was enormous and fundamental, the sound of the desert drinking. "It won't last long," he said. "Maybe 2-3 hours. When it stops, the air will smell like sage. There's nothing like it in the world." She looked at him standing in the doorway with rain still dripping off his hat brim, laughing slightly, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time, something she was careful not to name, something that was warm and unsettling and cautious all at once. "I'll make coffee," she said. "That would be good," he said. They sat at the table while the rain roared on the roof and drank coffee and talked, really talked, for the first time, without the careful formality of 2 strangers trying to be polite. She told him about her mother, who had been a school teacher before marriage and who had read aloud every evening, which was where Charlotte had gotten the habit. He told her about his father, who had come west from Kentucky in 1858 with nothing but a mule and a conviction that the land would eventually work in his favor, and who had been right, eventually, though it had taken everything he had. She told him about wanting to be a teacher herself, which she had not told anyone in a very long time because it was a thing she had put away when the money ran out. He listened to this with his full attention, his coffee cup held in both hands, his dark eyes steady on her face. "Why couldn't you be one?" he asked. "Because teachers in Ohio are expected to be unmarried or have a husband's permission and support," she said, "and I had neither. And the one position I was offered, the school board chairman made it clear that certain other considerations would make the position more secure. She said this flatly because it was a thing that was flatly true. I declined." Jedediah's expression did something complicated, a tightening quickly controlled. "I'm sorry," he said, "that you were put in that position." "It's the way things are," she said. "It's not the way things should be," he said quietly. She looked at him across the table. The lamp was lit and the rain was loud, and he was looking at her with complete sincerity. "No," she said, "it's not." They were quiet for a while after that. The rain slowed, and then the rain stopped, and Jedediah said, "Come on." And they went out onto the porch, and the air smelled exactly as he had said it would, like sage and clean stone and something electric and alive. And the night sky was washed so clean that the stars were almost violent in their brightness. Charlotte stood on the porch of the small ranch house in the Nevada desert, and the night smelled of sage. And beside her stood Jedediah Lockhart, and the thought she had sown into the lining of her mind. 3 weeks, and then I decide felt, for the first time, like something she had said about a different situation. In the 3rd week, several things happened that confirmed for Charlotte that she was in the process of losing an argument she was having with herself. The first was that she found, in the corner of the barn where Jedediah stored tools and old tack, a small writing desk, carefully wrapped in canvas, with a letter in the top drawer. The letter was addressed to her, but it had no date, and it was clear that it had been written and then set aside, because it was different in quality from the letters they had exchanged during the correspondence. Those had been careful and correct. This one was not careful. This one said, "Miss Fairchild, I need to tell you something I don't know how to put in a proper letter, which is that I have been afraid for 2 years that I might not be the kind of man that can be good to someone, because I don't know any more what that looks like. My father was good to my mother, but it cost him everything, and in the end she died still loving a place she also hated, and I've thought about that a great deal. What I want to say is that I am trying very hard to be clear with you and honest, and to not ask more than is fair. If you come and you find that this is not what you want, I will not hold it against you. This country is not easy on anyone, but it is especially not easy on women, and you should know that before you decide anything." The letter was unsigned, because it had never been finished or sent. Charlotte sat in the barn for a long time with the letter in her hands, and then she carefully refolded it and put it back in the drawer, and wrapped the canvas back around the desk, and went back to the house. That evening she said, "Where did the writing desk in the barn come from?" Jedediah was at the stove stirring something. He went very still. "That was my mother's," he said, without turning around. "She used it to write letters home to Kentucky." She stopped after a while when there was no one left to write to. "Why is it in the barn?" He was quiet for a moment. "I couldn't put it in the house," he said. It would have felt wrong to just put it in a corner, like it deserved better than that." He turned then, and his eyes met hers, and he said, "Why were you in the barn?" "I was looking for a mending kit," she said. "I found a hole in my boot that needed attending to." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, "I could bring the desk inside if you wanted it, for letters, or you could use it for other things." "I'd like that," she said. "Thank you." The second thing that happened in the 3rd week was a confrontation with a man named Dale Sutter. Dale Sutter ran a small cattle operation to the north of Jedediah's property, and he had, Charlotte gathered from various comments she had heard in town, a philosophy about land and water rights that was at odds with Jedediah's and with several of the other smaller ranchers in the valley. He was a big man, loud in the way that men are loud when they want to make the room understand who is in charge of it, and he came to the Lockhart property on a Wednesday afternoon while Jedediah was out checking the eastern fence line. Charlotte was in the kitchen garden when she heard the horse. Sutter dismounted and looked at her with the particular look of a man who is used to property and is assessing whether she is part of it. "You the new wife?" he said without introduction. "I'm Charlotte Fairchild," she said, and left it at that. "Lockhart around. He'll be back shortly. You're welcome to wait on the porch." He did not move toward the porch. He stood in the yard and looked at the fence line that bordered his property, and he said, "Tell Lockhart that the water situation needs discussing. There's been some rearrangements." Charlotte had been in this country long enough now to understand that rearrangements was a word that covered a great deal. "I'll tell him," she said. "You're from back east," Sutter said. It was not a question. "Ohio," she said. "Women from back east don't always understand how things work out here," he said. Charlotte looked at him steadily. "I find," she said, "that things work the same everywhere. Some people act fairly and some people find clever words to avoid it." Sutter looked at her for a long moment, and then he got back on his horse without another word and rode north. When Jedediah came back and she told him what had happened, his expression went through several things quickly. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Are you all right?" "I'm perfectly fine," she said. He wasn't threatening, just testing, I think. "What's the water situation?" he told her then, and the telling took a while, because it was complicated in the way that land and water rights in the West in 1878 were always complicated. A combination of prior appropriation law, which gave earlier settlers the first claim to water, and men like Sutter who had arrived later with more money and a willingness to be creative about physical infrastructure. The creek that ran behind Jedediah's property fed from a higher source that Sutter was now claiming to have diverted, at least partially. "He's been doing it gradually," Jedediah said. "Small adjustments, a channel here, a dam there. Nothing big enough to make one definitive complaint about. Adds up. Can you take it to the county court?" Charlotte asked. He looked at her as though the question had not fully occurred to him. "I've been thinking about it," he said slowly. "I wasn't sure I had enough documentation." "Then document it," she said. "Every adjustment, dates, measurements if you can get them. Build the case over time." She paused. "I could help you write it, the letters, the records. I write clearly. It's one of the things I can do." He looked at her for a moment. "You do that?" "It affects your property and your livelihood," she said. "Yes, I do that." The way he looked at her then was different from the way he had looked at her before. It was direct and warm and undisguised, and it lasted long enough that Charlotte felt it in her sternum. "All right," he said. "Then yes, I'd be grateful." Over the following days they sat at the writing desk, which was now installed in the main room, under the window that faced east in the evenings, and she helped him construct a careful, precise record of every adjustment Sutter had made to the waterway. Jedediah had a detailed memory for the land, and could describe exactly what had changed and when. Charlotte had the words to make it legible and legally coherent. It was a strange kind of collaboration, specific and practical, and it produced something in Charlotte that she recognized, slowly, as the particular satisfaction of being genuinely useful. She thought sometimes about the school board chairman in Ohio and what he had implied her usefulness was limited to, and she thought about how different it was to sit across from a man who leaned forward over a document she had written and said, "That's exactly right, that's what I meant, how did you?" and then looked at her as though she had done something remarkable. She was not falling in love. She was very clear with herself about this. She was becoming comfortable, which was different. She was becoming accustomed, which was also different. Comfort and custom were not love. But on the 17th evening, which was a Thursday, Jedediah came in from the barn after the usual time and set something on the table. It was a small glass jar, and inside it was a single stem of something that was not quite a wildflower but was clearly something he had found growing in a specific place and decided to bring in. It was desert marigold, she would later learn. Small, yellow, and wild, and it bloomed in the cracks of the most difficult ground. He did not make any comment about it. He just set it on the table and then went to the stove and poured himself coffee and said, "There's a letter from the county clerk's office about the Sutter situation. It came in the mail today." She sat at the table and looked at the desert marigold in its glass jar. She did not say anything about it. Neither did he. But she moved the jar to the windowsill so it would catch the morning light, and when she got up the next morning it was the first thing she saw, yellow and honest and wild. It was on the 19th day that everything broke open. It happened in the evening. Charlotte had been sitting on the porch with her Byron, Jedediah's Byron really, but he had not asked for it back, and she was reading, but she was not really reading. She was looking out at the desert and she was having the argument with herself again, the one that had been going on since the second week, the one where one side said I should leave, I have my plan, I have my small amount of money in the lining of my petticoat, I have always known I would not stay, and the other side said but. But with nothing after it, the word hovering there like something unfinished. She had not quite decided, she told herself. She had not quite made up her mind. She was still evaluating. Jedediah came up from the barn and sat on the top porch step, as he sometimes did, and looked at the horizon, which was going red and orange as it did every evening with a drama that Charlotte had entirely stopped being surprised by but had entirely failed to stop noticing. "I need to ask you something," he said. "All right," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him doing the thing he did where he found the precise words. "Are you planning to leave?" The directness of it was so characteristic that she almost laughed. She put the book down in her lap. "What makes you ask?" "A few things," he said. "The way you look at the road sometimes. The way you talk about Cincinnati like it's still something you're comparing everything to. And the fact that you haven't settled." He looked at the horizon. "You've been kind and you've been helpful and I know you've been honest, but I don't think you're here yet, not fully." Charlotte looked at her hands. "I came with a plan," she said. 3 weeks, I told myself, and if I found I couldn't, I would find a way to go. And now," he said. "Now it's 3 weeks, she said very quietly. He nodded slowly. He did not look at her, which she thought was deliberate. He was giving her room for the answer, whatever it was. "I see," he said. "Do you?" she said. "Because I'm not sure I do." He turned then and looked at her directly, and she looked back, and he said, "Charlotte." It was the first time he had used her given name. It landed in the evening air between them like something placed carefully. "I'm not going to tell you what to do," he said. "I'm not going to. I put those curtains up and I gave you the bedroom, and I've been trying very hard to show you that this is a place you could choose, not a place you'd be trapped. There's a difference." He paused. "But I need you to know, not to keep you, not to influence anything. I just need you to know that these 3 weeks have been the—" He stopped. He looked at his hands, which were clasped on his knees. "I haven't felt like I wasn't alone since my mother died. And these 3 weeks I've been awake in the mornings before dawn the way you're awake when there's something worth getting up for. I haven't had that in 2 years, maybe longer." Charlotte was very still. "That's all," he said. "I'm not asking for anything. You should know that, before you decide." She sat on the porch of the small ranch house and looked at the man who had put white curtains up the morning she arrived, who had told her he didn't want to presume, who had read Byron alone in the Nevada desert because his mother used to read aloud, who had helped her understand that loving something might require letting go of what you'd hoped it would be. And she felt the plan in the lining of her petticoat, and she felt the desert air on her face, and she felt, clearly and completely and without ambiguity, that she did not want to leave. She had forgotten, somewhere in the previous 19 days, all the reasons she had told herself she would. She could still recite them if she tried: the smallness of the house, the isolation, the uncertainty, the fact that she had come here out of necessity and not choice. She could recite them, but they felt like words from a letter written about a different situation. "Jed," she said. He looked at her. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. The stillness that came over him was profound. It was not dramatic. He did not move or speak for a moment, and the sunset lit him in its indiscriminate orange way. And then he said, very quietly, "All right." "I want to be clear," she said, because this was who she was, a woman who required precision even in the most unguarded moments. "I don't just mean I'll stay out the arrangement. I mean I'd like to try to build something here, with you, because I think," she paused, found the truth of it, "I think you might be the most genuinely decent man I've ever met, and I don't want to miss what that could be." He looked at her for a long time, and his dark eyes had that quality she had learned to read now, the opening, the warmth that didn't perform itself but simply was. "I'd like that," he said. "Very much." The night smelled of sage and dust and horses, and somewhere the cracked church bell of Calico Creek would ring in the morning, and Charlotte Fairchild sat on the porch of her new home and found that she had nothing she needed to run from, and something she very much wanted to run toward. The weeks that followed were a transformation, though they did not look like one from the inside. From the inside, they looked like the accumulation of ordinary things. A second chair on the porch so they could both sit there in the evenings. The kitchen garden expanded because Charlotte wanted to try growing tomatoes, which Jedediah pronounced unlikely but helped her plant anyway. The sound of two people moving around a small house who have learned each other's rhythms and no longer collide. He began, very slowly, to close the distance between careful courtesy and something warmer. She noticed it in the way he sometimes stood beside her when they were both at the stove, closer than strict necessity required. She noticed it in the way he had started to finish his sentences when he was talking to her, as though he had discovered that precision was easier with an audience that was paying real attention. She noticed it most one evening in October, 6 weeks after she had arrived, when they were sitting at the table after supper and he was reading. She had found him a copy of Great Expectations at the Calico Creek General Store, bought with her own small reserve of money, and presented it without ceremony. And his face had done the complicated warm thing, and she was working on mending one of his shirts, and the lamp was lit, and outside a wind was moving across the desert, and it was entirely, simply, quietly good, good in a way that had weight and substance and would not blow away with the next wind. She looked up from the mending and she said, "Jed." He looked up from the book. "I'd like to get married," she said, "properly, if you still want to." He set the book down on the table with the careful deliberateness of someone who wants to give a moment its full due. He looked at her across the table, across the lamp, across the 6 weeks of growing toward each other. "I still want to," he said. They were married at the Calico Creek Church on a Saturday in November of 1878, with Reverend Elias Cook officiating and the cracked bell doing its approximation of celebration, and Mabel Greer in the front row with an expression of severe satisfaction, and Harriet Dunmore on her mule outside the window because the mule didn't approve of churches. The Vega family came, and Dottie Hayes from the livery stable, and a great many other people from the surrounding area who had all, it turned out, been quietly invested in Jedediah Lockhart's happiness for some time. Charlotte wore her better dress, which she had altered slightly to better suit the occasion, and Jedediah wore his cleanest shirt and boots that he had taken seriously time to polish, and he stood at the altar looking at her with the particular quality of a man who is deeply, completely present in a moment. When the Reverend got to the part about the vows, Jedediah said his without looking at the book, because he had clearly memorized them, and his voice was steady and low and utterly certain. Charlotte said hers looking directly at him, and she meant every word, and she was not afraid. Afterward, Harriet Dunmore produced from somewhere a crock of actual apple brandy and said that this was a medical necessity at celebrations, and no one should look at her like that. The afternoon was long and bright and cold, and people talked and ate, and the children of the Vega family ran in the street, and Jedediah stood beside Charlotte with his hand at the small of her back, just resting there, warm and present, and she leaned very slightly into it. The first months of their marriage were the kind of months that don't make good stories in the telling, but are the substance of real life in the living. They were hard in some ways. The winter was dry but cold, and the cattle needed more attention, and the Sutter situation had still not been fully resolved by the county court, though their careful documentation had given the county clerk enough to issue a formal notice of inquiry that made Sutter considerably quieter than he had been. They were good in the ways that mattered. Jedediah had moved the writing desk to a better position against the window that faced east, as she had arranged it, but now with a proper chair that he had gotten from a carpenter in town. He told her one evening that he had been thinking about the schoolteacher thing, and had she considered, and he had said it carefully as though not sure if he was overstepping, that Calico Creek School was currently being taught by a woman who was leaving in the spring to follow her husband to California, and that the school board was going to need someone. Charlotte looked at him. "You spoke to the school board." "I spoke to Mabel Greer," he said. Who is effectively the school board? Charlotte thought about this. The school board in Ohio required a husband's permission, she said. This is Nevada, he said, and even if they didn't, you have my permission. You'd have it for anything you wanted to do. She crossed the room and stood in front of him and looked at his careful, earnest face, and she took his face in her hands and kissed him for the first time as a full declaration, not the gentle ceremony of their wedding, but the real thing, warm and deliberate and his. He went very still for a moment as though surprised, and then he wasn't still anymore. Spring came, and Charlotte Lockhart, she was adjusting to the name with a pleasure that surprised her, stood in front of 11 children in the Calico Creek schoolhouse on the first day of the spring term. And she was 34 months away from being the girl who had written to a stranger in Nevada because she was desperate, and she was in exactly the right place. The children were the variety that the West produced: children of ranchers, of miners, of the Vega family. 3 children whose parents she was not certain of, but who showed up every day and were clearly clever and interested. And 1 small girl named Addie who arrived on the first day with her shoes on the wrong feet and an expression of fierce intellectual ambition. Charlotte taught them reading and arithmetic and geography and a little history, and she tried to teach them the history honestly, which meant that she told them that the West they were living in had been, before it was theirs, someone else's, and that the people from whom it had been taken had names and languages and ways of understanding the world that deserved to be acknowledged, even if the children of Calico Creek could not give those things back. This caused some comment from certain parents. Mabel Greer, when Charlotte mentioned it to her, said, "Good. Let them comment. Truth is inconvenient or it isn't truth." Jedediah, when she told him, was quiet for a moment and then said, "My mother would have thought the same." He paused. "So do I." The Sutter situation resolved itself in June of 1879, which was 6 months after the county court issued its formal finding that Dale Sutter had indeed illegally diverted water from the natural course of Broken Creek in a manner that violated the prior appropriation rights of 3 downstream landowners, including Jedediah Lockhart. Sutter was required to restore the waterway to its original course and pay a modest fine that was probably less than it should have been, but was something. He did not come to the Lockhart property again after that, and the creek ran clear behind the house through the rest of that summer, which was very dry and very hot, and made the sound of moving water feel like something almost sacred. In July of 1879, Charlotte discovered that she was expecting a child. She told Jedediah on a Tuesday evening on the porch, and she was not nervous about telling him, which she thought later was interesting, that she had arrived at a place in this marriage where she was not nervous about telling him something enormous. She was sitting on the porch with a glass of water and he had come up from the barn, and she just said it simply and watched his face. His face went through about 6 things in 4 seconds, and then he sat down next to her on the porch steps and he took her hand very carefully and held it. "Are you all right?" he said. "I mean, are you well?" "I'm very well," she said. "I'm a little tired in the mornings. Harriet says that's ordinary." "You told Harriet before you told me," he said. "She came by Tuesday morning and she took one look at me and said, 'You're expecting, go lie down,'" Charlotte said. "It's very hard to keep secrets from Harriet." He laughed, and it was the full version of his laugh, not the short, surprised version, but the real one, which she had been collecting over the months like someone gathering something rare and precious. "Are you happy about it?" she asked, because she wanted to know, and she always asked what she wanted to know. "Charlotte," he said, and his voice was everything his face had just done in miniature. He stopped and started and then abandoned precision entirely. "Yes, I'm happy about it. Enormously." She leaned her head on his shoulder, which she had started doing in the winter, and which he had responded to by holding very still, and then carefully, gradually, leaning into her in return. "I was thinking," she said, "if it's a boy, I'd like to name him Thomas, after my father. Thomas Lockhart," he said, trying it. "That's a good name. And if it's a girl, I'd like to discuss it," she said. "I don't want to be the only one who chooses." He was quiet for a moment. "Ruth," he said, "if it's a girl, that was my mother's name." Charlotte lifted her head and looked at him. "Ruth," she said. "Yes." The pregnancy was neither easy nor terrible. It was honest work, which Charlotte had come to understand was how this land did everything. She continued teaching through the fall term, which caused some commentary from some quarters and none at all from others. Mabel Greer, who was now so firmly in Charlotte's corner that she had started keeping a specific jar of lemon drops on the counter that she produced whenever Charlotte came into the store, said that women had been working through pregnancies since the beginning of time, and anyone who thought otherwise should be asked to do a full day's ranch work while expressing their opinion. Jedediah simply rearranged his schedule so that he was at the house more often without making any performance of it, and drove her to school in the mornings so she didn't have to walk the half-mile, and listened at the dinner table when she told him about the children's progress with his full attention and occasional questions that showed he was genuinely interested. He had, she thought, without either of them explicitly deciding to make it so, become her best friend. She had not had a best friend since Cincinnati, and the one she'd had there had been the kind of friend who was more comfortable than genuine. This was different. She could say anything to him, and he would hear the actual thing she was saying, not the polite version or the expected version, but the real thing. And in return, he told her things slowly, over time, because he was not a fast talker even with her about the land, about his father, about the loneliness of the 2 years before she came, about the way he had almost not placed the advertisement and had only done it because Harriet Dunmore had sat across from him at his own table one afternoon and said, "Jed Lockhart, you are going to waste yourself entirely if you don't have the sense to try," and he had not been able to argue with her. "I'm glad Harriet is difficult," Charlotte said when he told her this. "So am I," he said, "more than I used to be." Thomas James Lockhart was born on a Thursday morning in February of 1880 in the small bedroom of the ranch house with Harriet Dunmore and the town's doctor, a man named Beaumont who smelled of tobacco and had steady hands, in attendance. Jedediah was sent to the porch, which he accepted with very bad grace, and Charlotte could hear him out there the whole time, his boots on the boards, pacing with a rhythm that was almost musical in its anxiety. When Harriet opened the door and said, "Come in and meet your son," he came through the door with the expression of a man who has been bracing for bad news for so long that good news takes a moment to arrive. Thomas was small and red and furious about the transition from where he had been to where he now was, which Charlotte thought was an entirely reasonable response. Jedediah sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby in his arms, and watched the man who had difficulty finding words for things find himself entirely without any. He sat there holding his son, and his face was open in a way she had rarely seen it, without any of the careful management, just the pure thing, and he looked up at her and said, "Thank you," in a voice that was barely voice at all, and she understood that he meant something enormous and possibly inarticulable by it. "Thank you," she said back, and she meant it to cover the same enormous territory. Thomas was a healthy, loud, demanding child who slept in short, aggressive bursts and woke with strong opinions about everything. Charlotte, who had expected motherhood to feel like something she was managing on behalf of someone else, found instead that it was a thing she wanted entirely, that her son was a person she found genuinely interesting, and that the combination of teaching and mothering and the ranch and Jedediah was a fullness that she had not known she was capable of holding. There were hard days. There were days when the teaching was difficult, and Thomas was impossible and Jedediah came in late, because the cattle had escaped through a broken fence, and she had been alone all day with a screaming infant and a cold stove, and she sat at the kitchen table at the end of it and felt the bone-level exhaustion of it all. On those days, Jedediah would come in and read the room with his particular accuracy, and he would take Thomas without being asked, and he would put coffee on, and he would sit across from her and say, "What do you need?" in the same tone he had used in the cattle crisis, matter of fact and genuine. Sometimes what she needed was practical help. Sometimes what she needed was to talk. Sometimes what she needed was to sit in silence with someone she trusted, and he was good at all of these things in different ways, and the ways he was not good at he was willing to try. "You're better at this than you think you are," she told him once, when Thomas was 8 months old and had fallen asleep on Jedediah's chest in the rocking chair that had been brought over from Harriet Dunmore's spare room. "At what?" he said. "At being a family," she said. He looked down at the sleeping baby on his chest. He looked up at her. His dark eyes were steady and full of a warmth that was their normal condition now, the condition that had been there since the evening on the porch when he had said, "I've been awake in the mornings the way you're awake when there's something worth getting up for." "I had a good teacher," he said. Charlotte had been going to make a modest response to this, but instead she got up from her chair and went and stood next to the rocking chair and leaned down and kissed his forehead, which was not a thing she usually did but felt entirely right, and he turned his face up to hers, and she kissed his mouth too, gently so as not to wake Thomas. And he reached up with the hand that wasn't supporting the baby and tucked it around the back of her neck and held her there for a moment in a way that said everything he didn't need to say. The years began to accumulate in the way that years do when they are good ones, not the slow drag of years that are merely endured, but the quick, surprising passage of years that are full. Charlotte continued teaching at the Calico Creek School through 3 terms, and then took a year off when it became clear that another child was on the way, and then returned afterward because Mabel Greer had told the new school board chairman, a man named Porter who had arrived from Denver and had certain old-fashioned ideas about women in professional positions, that Mrs. Lockhart was the finest teacher Calico Creek had ever had, and he could keep his ideas in his hat where they belonged. Porter had looked at Mabel for a long moment and then said, "All right." Mabel told this story several times over the following years, with slight embellishment each time. The second child was born in the summer of 1882 and was a girl and was named Ruth Eleanor Lockhart. She arrived in the world with the same general philosophy as her brother, loud, opinionated, and certain that she had been inconvenienced, but where Thomas had a look of patient observation even as an infant, Ruth had a look of immediate intention. She was going to do things, that look said. She was going to do them now. Thomas, who was 2.5 when his sister arrived, regarded her for a long moment when she was presented to him, and then said, with the gravity that he was already developing as his primary mode of communication, "She is very small." He then offered her his wooden horse, which Jedediah had carved through the previous winter, and this seemed to him to settle the matter of their relationship entirely. Jedediah carved Ruth a rabbit in the months that followed. Charlotte watched him carve it one evening. He did it in the main room by the fire, working with a small knife with the same precise attention he gave to everything, and Thomas was asleep in his room, and Ruth was in the cradle making small sounds that suggested she was debating the relative merits of sleeping and not sleeping. Charlotte was at the writing desk, working on a letter to the state education office about resources for frontier schools, which was a project she had been pursuing for 2 years and which had produced, so far, a new supply of primers and a very polite set of letters back. She looked up from the letter and she looked at him by the fire, and she thought about the stagecoach and the dust and the plan in the lining of her petticoat and the white muslin curtains in the window. She thought about the night it rained and the smell of sage and the desert marigold in its glass jar. She thought about a letter that had never been sent, in a writing desk wrapped in canvas in a barn, from a man who had been afraid he didn't know how to be good to someone. She thought about an evening on a porch when he had said, "I've been awake in the mornings the way you're awake when there's something worth getting up for," and about how she had said, "I'm not going anywhere," and about how both of those things had turned out to be true in all the ways that mattered. He looked up from his carving and caught her watching him, and the look she got in return was the full, unguarded version, the warmth without the careful management, the openness she had been the particular audience for ever since a Thursday evening on a porch. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said, which was not true, but he knew it wasn't true, which meant she didn't need to say the true thing because it was already understood. He smiled, the full version of his smile, which he gave more freely now than he used to, and went back to the rabbit. In 1883, a small thing happened that Charlotte would think about for years afterward. She was in Mabel Greer's store, purchasing fabric and dried goods, when a woman came through the door with a carpetbag in her hand, and a look that Charlotte recognized with the immediacy of someone seeing their own reflection. The woman was perhaps 22, with reddish hair and gray eyes and the careful posture of someone bracing for an unknown quantity. She looked at the inside of the store and then at Mabel and said, I'm here for a Mr. Avery Coles. I wrote to him. I'm expected." Mabel turned to Charlotte with an expression that was doing several things at once. Charlotte set down her fabric. "I'll wait," she said to Mabel. Then she looked at the woman. "I'm Charlotte Lockhart. I came here the same way you did 5 years ago." The woman's careful posture shifted almost imperceptibly. "You stayed," she said. "I stayed," Charlotte said. "Are you all right?" "I don't know yet," the woman said honestly. Charlotte nodded. "That's the right answer," she said. "Come and have some coffee while you wait, and I'll tell you about this town." The woman's name was Clara Webb, and she and Avery Coles were married the following April, and they became, over the years, a family that lived 3 miles south on a property that ran adjacent to the Lockharts, and Clara became someone Charlotte valued enormously, a friend in the fullest sense, the kind of friend she had not had since she was young and had not thought she would find again in the desert. Calico Creek grew around them. The railroad came closer, not to the town itself but to a terminus 20 miles east, which changed the nature of things. Goods arrived faster. Strangers passed through. The texture of the community shifted. Some of the old ranchers sold out to larger operations and moved away. Some of the miners struck something worth striking and became briefly wealthy, and then made various decisions about what to do with that. The town got a second saloon, and then a telegraph office, and then a proper doctor's practice with its own building. And the school was expanded from 1 room to 2, which meant Charlotte needed an assistant. And the assistant she found was the eldest Vega boy, who had grown into a serious young man named Raphael, and who turned out to have a genius for mathematics that Charlotte cultivated with the particular attention she gave to anything she found genuinely promising. Jedediah's cattle operation grew modestly and honestly. He did not have the temperament for rapid expansion, and he said so without apology. What he wanted was to do what he did well and to pass it on to his children in good condition. His fence lines were solid, his water rights were secure, and the county court record on this was thorough, thanks to the documentation Charlotte had helped build. And his reputation in the county was exactly what she had perceived from the beginning, the kind of solid, unhurried respect that cannot be manufactured or hurried. He taught Thomas to ride when the boy was 4, and to read the land when he was 5, and to fix a fence line when he was 6, but he also sat with him on Sunday evenings and read aloud, as Charlotte did, because they had agreed early that this was something the children would grow up with. Thomas listened with his father's quiet attention. Ruth listened with her own brand of intense, slightly impatient interest, frequently interrupting to ask questions. Charlotte thought that Ruth would either be a teacher or a lawyer and told Jedediah so one evening. "Why not both?" he said. She looked at him. "Times are changing," he said with that steady, unhurried conviction. "By the time she's grown, it might be possible." "You might be right," Charlotte said. "You taught me to say things clearly," he said. "So I'll say this clearly. I want both my children to have every opportunity, whatever that takes." She had been going to say something practical in response, but instead she set down what she was doing and she said, "Jed." He looked at her. "I love you," she said, because it had always been true, and she was not always as precise about saying it as she should be. and it was a thing that deserved regular and direct expression. His face did the full thing, the opening and the warmth and the complete presence in the moment. "I love you," he said back, and he said it with the same careful certainty that he applied to everything he meant deeply. In the fall of 1885, on a morning that was bright and cold and smelled of approaching winter, Charlotte stood in the kitchen making biscuits while Ruth, who was 3, sat on the floor reorganizing a pile of wooden blocks according to a system that appeared to be entirely her own, and Thomas, who was 5, was at the writing desk with his primer. Outside, Jedediah was doing something with the fence on the south side, and Charlotte could hear the occasional sound of the mallet and the solid conversation of the cattle. She realized, standing at the stove with flour on her hands, simply and comprehensively happy. Not a complicated happiness, not the kind that is always watching over its shoulder for what might take it away, but the solid, daily, expansive kind that is built from small things stacked with care. She thought about the girl who had stepped off a stagecoach in the Nevada dust with a carpetbag and a plan to leave. She thought about the crumpled letter and the small amount of money sewn into her petticoat and the 3 weeks she had given herself. She tried to think of all the reasons she had assembled for leaving, the isolation, the uncertainty, the smallness of the house, and found that they felt theoretical now, like arguments in a debate about someone else's life. She had forgotten them. Not forgotten in the sense of being ignorant of them, but forgotten in the way that you forget why you were afraid of something once you have learned to love it properly, once you have walked through the middle of it and found it habitable and full of light. The front door opened and Jedediah came in, cold from the morning, stamping the dust from his boots. He went straight to the stove for the coffee, which was always there waiting for him because she had made a point of keeping it there, a small dailiness that required nothing and communicated everything. He poured a cup and turned and looked at the scene, Charlotte at the stove, Ruth on the floor with her blocks, Thomas at the writing desk frowning at a word, and he had the look he got sometimes in the mornings, the look of a man who cannot quite believe his circumstances and is very carefully being grateful for them. "Cold out," he said. "I can see that," she said. "Come here." He came and stood beside her at the stove, coffee in hand, and she leaned against him briefly, and he put one arm around her shoulders and held her there for a moment, warm and solid and certain. Ruth looked up from her blocks. "Papa is cold," she announced. "Very cold," Jedediah confirmed. Thomas did not look up from his primer, but he said, "I can read this word now," in the tone of someone making an important announcement. The word, Charlotte could see over his shoulder, was understand. "Can you," she said. "Understand," he said. "It means to know a thing properly." "That's right," she said. He went back to the primer, satisfied. Ruth went back to her blocks. Jedediah held his coffee and stood beside Charlotte, and the biscuits were nearly ready, and the cattle were speaking to each other outside in the cold morning, and the desert light came through the east window and landed on the writing desk that had once belonged to a woman who had loved and grieved this country, and then made peace with it. Charlotte would teach another 12 years at the Calico Creek School, and she would help bring about the expanded curriculum that eventually meant the children of that desert community had access to the same education as children in the city, more or less, even if the books were always slightly behind the times, and the building was still smaller than it should have been. She would write more letters to the state education office than she could count, and some of them would be answered and some would not, and the ones that were answered would matter enormously to specific children in specific years. Rafael Vega would go on to study at a university in California, the first in his family to do so, and he would write Charlotte a letter after his first year there that made her cry in the good way, that particular pride that is not possessive but simply glad. Thomas Lockhart would grow into his father's quiet intensity and his mother's precise way with words, and would become, by the time he was 20, someone who could fix a fence line and recite Byron and do mathematical calculations in his head, and who would fall in love with a girl from the next county named Alice, who had her own fierce intelligence and her own strong opinions, and whom Charlotte loved from the moment she met her. Ruth Lockhart would prove Charlotte right, in her own particular way. She would leave Calico Creek at 18 to study at a women's college in San Francisco, which would be difficult and expensive, and which Jedediah would help her finance by selling 12 head of cattle without complaint, saying only that it was a better investment than most of the things he could have done with 12 cattle. Ruth would come home in the summers, bringing books and ideas and new vocabulary and a particular kind of bright energy that filled the small house almost to bursting. And she and Charlotte would sit on the porch until very late in the evenings talking about everything they had both been thinking about. And Jedediah would fall asleep in his chair in the main room, because he was still an early riser, and Charlotte would cover him with a blanket and go to bed, and it would be very ordinary and very fine. Harriet Dunmore lived to be 87 years old, which surprised no one who knew her, and she continued to produce apple preserves and blunt assessments of everyone's choices until very nearly the end. She left her property to her nephew, who came from Virginia, a young man who was somewhat bewildered by everything he found but who was, Jedediah said, salvageable. Mabel Greer ran the store for another 20 years, and then her daughter took it over, and it remained, in all its multiple functions, store, post office, waiting room, repository of all town knowledge, exactly what it had always been. On a warm evening in September of 1895, which was 17 years after Charlotte Fairchild had stepped off a stagecoach into the Nevada dust with a plan to leave, Charlotte and Jedediah sat on the porch of their house, which had been extended over the years and was now considerably more house than it had originally been, and watched the sunset that was the same sunset it had always been, red and orange and slightly aggressive in its beauty. Jedediah had gone gray at his temples, which suited him, and Charlotte had lines beside her eyes that she had decided were honest rather than unfortunate. They were both 41, and they sat in their chairs with the ease of two people who have spent 17 years learning exactly how to occupy the same space, which is to say, perfectly. "Do you remember the curtains?" Charlotte asked. He looked at her. "What curtains?" "The white muslin curtains, the ones you put up the morning I arrived." He was quiet for a moment, and she knew that he remembered. "I wasn't sure you'd stay even the night," he said. "I thought you looked at the house when we came up the road, and I watched you look at it, and I thought, she's from Ohio, and this is very small, and maybe the curtains were a foolish idea." "They weren't," she said. "No," he said. "That was the first thing," she said. "That was the moment I thought maybe." He looked at her, and the evening was very long and gold, and he said, "What convinced you to stay, in the end, the actual thing?" She thought about it seriously, because he asked seriously. "You told me you'd been awake in the mornings," she said. "The way you're awake when there's something worth getting up for, and I realized that I had been too since I arrived, and I didn't want to go back to not being that." He nodded slowly, looking at the horizon. "What would you have done," she asked, "if I'd left?" "I would have been very sad," he said with simple directness. "And I would have gotten up the next morning anyway, and the one after." He paused. "But I'm glad I didn't have to." "So am I," she said. The desert was going from gold to purple in that way it had, and the first star was out, and somewhere a coyote was beginning its nightly conversation with the dark. The cattle were settled for the evening in the pasture beyond the barn. Thomas was in his own house now, 3 miles east, where Alice had planted a kitchen garden that was already better than anything Charlotte had ever managed. Ruth was somewhere in San Francisco doing something ambitious. Jedediah reached over and took Charlotte's hand, as he had made a habit of doing on evenings like this, and held it with the easy certainty of a man who has been doing something for 17 years and fully expects to do it for 17 more. Charlotte Lockhart sat on her porch in the Nevada evening, her husband's hand in hers. The desert spread out before her in its ancient and indifferent beauty, and she felt, from the solid ground beneath the chair to the wide sky above the ridge, completely and irrevocably home. She had come speaking only of leaving. She had arrived with her reasons all assembled and her escape route already planned, and she had been very certain of herself, the way you are very certain when you haven't yet encountered the thing that is going to make you reconsider everything. The thing had been white muslin curtains, put up by a man who didn't want to presume. It had been Byron on a shelf and a cot in the corner and boots that told the truth. It had been a voice saying Charlotte across a porch in the Nevada evening, and the smell of sage after rain, and a desert marigold in a glass jar placed without comment on a kitchen table. It had been a man who said, "I've been awake in the mornings the way you're awake when there's something worth getting up for," and meant it without ornament, and who had been right that she had been too, and who had given her, without knowing he was giving her anything at all, one honest and unglamorous and utterly sufficient reason to stay. She had forgotten all the others. She never went looking for them again.